The words hit the room like a dropped glass. I'm leaving. I'm starting a new life. He raised his champagne flute as if to punctuate the declaration, and the toast he'd been rehearsing for our daughter's graduation dissolved into stunned silence. The restaurant's low murmur died. Utensils stilled midair. People turned their heads, their faces a map of curiosity, shock, and the polite cruelty of strangers enjoying a spectacle. I sat very still. My name is Elena Martin. I am 53. For nearly 3 decades, I'd been the steady current in our family organizer, accountant, homeowner of small emergencies, encourager of grand ideas. I cloaked my own ambitions in the shawl of support while Richard chased reinvention after. Reinvention, each more dazzling than the last, until the shine wore off. Tonight was supposed to be my daughter Sophia's night, her commencement, her celebration. Instead, Richard chose to make it his declaration. I watched the finishing of his sentence, the expectant flash of triumph on his face, the way his shoulders straightened as he imagined the gasps and the inevitable roar of attention. He had rehearsed this. He had planned it for months. He imagined himself the brave protagonist, stepping into a new chapter while the rest of us stood frozen on the sidelines. I let him have his moment. I smiled calm, small, practiced, and let a folded ivory envelope slide from my handbag, too. The table beside his plate. He blinked, startled. What's that? He croaked, the bravado cracking. Something for you to read later, I said, and kissed Sophia's cheek. Her cap had slipped back on her head. Her mascara glistened in. The restaurant's soft light. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. This is your day. Then I stood, smoothed the skirt of my dress out of habit, and addressed the room with the voice I used for everything that needed steadying. Please enjoy your meal. Happy graduation, everyone. I turned and walked out. The door closed behind me and the summer air hit like a cool hand. For the first time in a long while, I felt my lungs expand without apology. Behind me, a slam of the door. A voice Richard's rising in panic. Elena, what is this? What did you do? I walked faster because the quiet control I felt was fragile and because the script I had written for this moment required movement. That envelope held more than paper. It contained months of preparation and the blunt arithmetic of someone who'd spent 30 years reconciling ledgers and imagining contingencies. While Richard adored drama grand gestures, dramatic exits, the illusion of spontaneity I had kept records. I noticed the small transfers first, a trickle from our joint account into one in an unfamiliar name, a lunch receipt at a champagne-splashed bistro, a deposit for a condo we could not afford on paper. He'd been siphoning money and hyping a future for 2, while telling me we needed to watch our retirement projections, when I could have confronted him. I paused not out of cowardice, but because the quiet part of me wanted to be sure. A life of numbers sharpens the eye. You learn how patterns reveal themselves, how one-off transactions turn into a story. The story I uncovered was worse than a lapse of judgment. It was a plan. Transfer funds, secure a second life, announce separation at the perfect public moment. To minimize his accountability, there was also the phone. He'd left it unlocked one afternoon, careless perhaps. In the hubris of secrecy and a thread of messages pulled back the curtain. Plans, places, phrases like finally free and beach house. And the woman, Lauren, younger, bright, someone I'd once smiled at across parties, someone who'd sat at our table at holiday dinners. She called me once about resumes, and I had offered tips. She'd been practicing closeness while the rest of us pretended not to see the prenuptial agreement, signed when we were young and cautious, and he had less than me in inherited savings, had been his idea. He'd wanted protection, couldn't imagine then how it might bind him in ways he had never considered. He'd insisted upon clauses that sounded reasonable, asset division, protections. One clause, however, was a fidelity provision that neither of us paid much attention to in the sunlit naivete of youth. It stayed there, quiet as a seed. I read it again and found the seed had roots. The fidelity clause made infidelity a trigger, a contractual breach that shifted ownership in unmistakable ways of I spoke with an attorney. I documented transfers. I recorded conversations when I could. I filed papers the morning of the commencement, not to ruin our daughter's day, but to seize the legal momentum, and then I handed that envelope to Richard in front of friends and family and left the celebration in a soft, self-possessed arc. People expected tears, a scene. They imagined a clattering commotion, a wife sobbing, a man triumphantly leaving. Instead, I left a quiet note in my posture, intact. In the car, I allowed myself a smile that was both bitter and relieved. The plan had worked. Not because of vengeance, but because of control, the control I'd lost over my own life for decades. Traded back into my hands. I drove home to our house abroad. Red brick on a quiet street, the garden we'd planted together now peppered with perennials that marked seasons more faithfully than we ever had. Inside, everything looked arranged as before. Family photos, a clock that still chimed every hour, the chairs with the sunlight worn into the arms. But the closet in our bedroom revealed his real plans, suitcases tucked into a corner, shirts folded with the obsessive precision of someone who believed in order when it served him. He arrived minutes later, the front door betraying his entrance, with a slam that would have been comic if not for the way it signaled panic. "Elena," he barked, "where were you?" He held the envelope and waved the corner of it like a flag. "You served me papers today? On our daughter's graduation?" "I filed when it made sense," I said. "You chose to make a scene. I chose to make a plan." My voice stayed steady. I'd rehearsed this part with 1,000 small affirmations passed in quiet rooms. "We all make choices, Richard. You had yours." He reached for a narrative I had heard before history. Shared sacrifice, the gravity of years. 28 years, he said, as if a number could be a shield. 28 years, I replied. "And yet you found a way to betray them." He scoffed and told me the prenup had expired, that legal counsel would confirm. He went very still when I read him the clause aloud, wording that spelled out consequences for a spouse who formed a new household while still married. The color left his face like a bad set of lines at a play's end. The very document he had championed as insurance against the world was now a rope around his neck. Panic unspooled in him like a loose wire. He fumbled for shelters. "This is cold. This is not you." He tried the softer appeals, the memory-laden pleas. He accused me of cruelty. He begged. I listened because sometimes people's worst moments are as instructive as their best, and because I owed him truth. "You moved money," I said. "You rented a place in both our names. You tried to create a second life while erasing me from the edges." He protested. Of course he protested. But a voice recording I'd made his voice on his own phone, planning the timing of his announcement, softened his argument into an admission. His lawyer would later call those recordings ethically murky. The fact remained that the narrative he'd wanted to spin unraveled under the weight of facts. He called his sister. He dialed a friend. He stomped through the rooms like a man trying to reclaim the map of his life. I said I would be staying with Margaret, his sister, but that she already knew. She'd seen him and Lauren at a holiday party months back and had confronted him. He promised then, she said, and when promise turned into pattern, she came to me. Against his assumptions, Margaret chose truth over family theater. I told him to move his things. "Tomorrow," I said. "You have until tomorrow evening." He became urgent. "What about Sophia?" As if our daughter were an object to be positioned, not a human being with agency and heartbreak. I had held the news from her to protect the last semester of her life. That protection was of selfish kindness, and she would be angry for being excluded. But I had also wanted her degree, her moment to belong to her. His plan with Lauren had several weak seams. The application for their shared lease had been flagged for credit concerns. The coastal property he'd eyed was still only a listing he had bookmarked on a website. He relied upon image and bravado. He'd not done the accounting. That oversight was a familiar brand for him. Bold ideas, little follow-through. Showmanship over structure. Margaret's small bungalow felt like refuge. We drank wine and let the absurdity settle. He always loved an audience, she said. But this is theater built on lies. Sophia arrived with mascara tracks and a cap slipping from her head. She was the living ledger of our family, compassionate, talented, quick to forgive, slower to trust. She flopped onto the couch and asked a single blunt question. Why didn't you tell me? I wanted to protect your finals, I said. You deserve to finish without the drama. She accepted the answer with the existential anger of someone who had been presented with this kind of betrayal before, just not from the person who had tucked her in at night. We told her everything in measured sentences. She listened. She was not the spectacle he had imagined for her day. She was a person who could see both of us dot in the days that followed. Things moved through channels neither of us could fully control. I met with Marcus Hill, an attorney who spoke in clean, precise language and who respected a woman who had brought numbers and narratives into the room. He filed emergency motions. He moved to freeze accounts that were clearly being positioned for discretionary spend. The judge, a woman with an eye like a seamstress, read the prenup and the transfers and ruled to maintain the hold while a fuller discovery occurred. Richard called the freeze vindictive. I had not intended vindictiveness. I had intended protection. But protection and punishment can sometimes wear the same face. The law, however, has an appetite for written things, signed agreements, bank records, letters. It liked the story I'd amassed. News moved through our social circle like ripples. Friends called with sympathy or scandal. Some drifted away. People have an odd moral gravity. They circle toward whichever side affirms their own sense of virtue. That hurt the slow erosion of acquaintances who'd once filled our Christmas table, but it was bearable when compared with the ticking clarity of what I was building. An independence I had not let myself claim for too long. For a while I allowed myself the small, fierce pleasure of setting up an office. I leased a modest square above a bakery and spent mornings arranging bookshelves and afternoon sunlight. I launched a consultancy, numbers and transition planning for women at the pivot points of life: divorce, widowhood, job loss, solo financial planning. I named it Anchor Point Financial, not because I loved the sound, but because I loved the idea. Stability and motion. Clients came too at first, both women who had walked through fire and needed someone to show them how to manage the ashes. Word of mouth is an economy of trust. Trust begets clients. Sophia called from Charleston, her voice brightening as she described her marketing internship turning into a role. I'm so proud of you, Mom, she said one evening. You're doing what I always hoped for you. Her pride warmed me in an unfamiliar way. It was not linked to sacrifice. It was for me. Richard's story peeled away faster than his armor. Lauren moved out within weeks of the freeze. She'd been attracted to the idea of a partnership with access to certain luxuries, and when that access proved more image than asset, she moved on. He found a small apartment with the money left in his personal account after legal fees. Our mutual friends, who had once complimented him on his charisma, now mentioned his name in measured tones. The court proceedings were clinical. The judge read, compared dates, traced transfers. Evidence will strip romance from betrayal and leave. It's stark like a winter branch. The prenuptial agreement remained enforceable. The fidelity clause tilted the division of assets in my favor in a way that felt not merely legal but moral. It was a calibration of the harm he had caused, an attempt, by the law, to rebalance, when the divorce was final on what would have been. Our 29th anniversary, Richard looked older than his years, hallowed by the consequences of a life lived loudly without regard to the arithmetic of promises. He approached me outside the courthouse with the last of his dignity. I made a mistake, he said, the words small and true. Is there any chance? No, I answered. The voice that returned the refusal was steady and kind and final, like a door closing gently but without ambiguity. He understood. Perhaps for the first time, he felt the weight of a life's choices in his bones. I hope you find something like happiness, he added, and for once there was no theater in him. Months later, Anchor Point grew. I moved from that little office above the bakery into a space with a proper reception area and hired a small team who believed in the work. We ran workshops on budgeting for single women, seminars on retirement planning for widows, and one-on-one sessions with women who'd never had a financial map before. I learned to love the rhythm of advising. It was a work that used the two halves of me numbers and empathy in a way I had never allowed. Sophia visited often. We cooked dinners for two, and for the first time the roles in our home resembled a friendship more than a parent-child transaction. She sometimes said, over pasta, "You know what's funny? If Dad had been honest, he might have kept half of everything." Her observation was not gloating. It was the pragmatism of someone grounded. "People don't always see past what they want in the moment," I told her. There were small ironies. The very prenup he thought would protect him became his legal downfall. The quiet, meticulous record-keeping I'd scoffed at when I was younger. The spreadsheets, the passive savings accounts tucked away became the architecture of my independence. I did not relish the harm, but I did relish the clarity. I sometimes thought of Lauren, how she had sat in our lives and smiled. I felt less fury now and more in odd sympathy. People are often shaped by what they think they can obtain rather than who they are. Her leaving was not a victory. It was an unraveling. She'd been part of the story, but she had never known the subtext. At night, when the house was quiet, I would walk the rooms and notice the things I had kept. A teacup chipped at the rim, a photograph of Sophia at 5 with a crooked grin, a travel brochure for a trip never taken. I would touch the spine of a book I'd read 20 years ago and remember who I thought I would be. The woman who had once subtracted her own dreams and neat columns had become someone who added. The new life did not arrive in a single sweeping moment. It arrived in appointments kept and clients whose tears I dried and whose ledgers I organized. In a Saturday when Sophia and I signed up for a pottery class and both laughed at how our vases collapsed in the kiln. It arrived in neighbors bringing over lemon bars and in a friend and old colleague calling to ask if I might mentor her daughter. It arrived in small mercies. Once by chance, I found myself at the same upscale restaurant where everything had been announced. A woman at the next table looked at me and smiled. No recognition, only an easy friendliness. I thought about the envelope, about the legal papers, about the way people rehearse their exits and expect applause. I thought about the freedom bought by a lifetime of particular choices. And I realized the thing I valued most in the end wasn't the house or the accounts. Though both were welcome, it was the reclamation of time, the permission to live in my hours. There were moments of doubt, of course. I questioned whether my choice to keep the graduation day mostly intact for Sophia had been selfish decomposed into kindness, or whether withholding truth had been a liberty I had no right to take. She forgave me in time, not because I deserved it, but because she recognized I had tried to shield her. Forgiveness is not erasing. It is recognizing the human limits in another. When friends asked if I had felt the sweet, awful relief of retribution, I would laugh. Revenge, I told them, is a fairy tale we tell ourselves. What I wanted was fairness and a map back to myself. The envelope had been a mechanism. More importantly, it had been a boundary. It announced that I would no longer be collateral in someone else's fantasy. In my work, I met women who carried stories of quiet erasure. A widow who discovered after her husband's death the estate papers had been mismanaged. A woman whose husband's signature had quietly stripped away her finances. A midlife student learning how to invest again. We made plans. We resituated portfolios. We opened accounts in their names. We taught them to reconcile their hopes with their ledgers. They taught me, in return, how resilience is not a single roar but a series of soft, persistent acts. One afternoon, Sophia called from the marketing office in Charleston. "Mom, I just realized something," she said. "Your office is full of things I always thought I wanted for myself. You're giving me the blueprint?" Her voice held a warmth that felt like the completion of a circle. "I'm proud of you," she added, and I believed her. Sometimes people imagine that life after betrayal is either sunshine or ruin. In truth, it is a mosaic. There are pieces you throw away, pieces you polish, and pieces you find under the couch that make you laugh. I kept the granite countertops, the ivy that climbed our backyard wall, and the grandfather clock that still chimed with a precise, comforting tone. I let go of the guilt that had been collected like dust. I did not gloat at Richard's downfall. I felt a sober satisfaction watching consequences align with choices. When the final divorce papers were signed and filed, the courthouse felt oddly ceremonial. We had moved through months of negotiations, court orders, depositions. The end was not a single moment, but a series of administrative closures, the transfer of titles, the release of accounts, the withdrawal of finality that left a hollow space where the ante had once been. Walking out into the afternoon light, I felt like someone who had learned to sail. There was a chart on the table, a map to a coast I had not known I wanted, and I felt that the wind would take me there. Months turned into a year. Anchor Point grew. A woman I'd once tutored in small ways became a strategic partner. My team became an odd family of women with calculators and generous hearts. Sophia called often, and sometimes we'd talk about trivial things, a recipe to try, a book she loved, a film she'd just seen. It was ordinary and exquisite. When people asked what I'd learned, I would say, pay attention to your life's small entries. Keep your own ledger. Boundaries are not mean. They are maps. And when someone chooses a narrative that includes you, as a background, it's within your right to reclaim foreground. On the anniversary of Sophia's graduation, I took her to the same restaurant. We sat at a small table near the window. The mater d' recognized me and offered a small, respectful nod. We did not need fanfare. We ordered simply and sat in a light that felt earned. Sophia reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." In her eyes, there was a reflection of a woman who had lived, learned, and loved her way back into herself. That night, walking home beneath trees that had shaded our yard for years, I thought of the envelope and of all the things it represented. Not vengeance, but revelation. Not triumph, but clarity. I had been made small by another's choices for long enough. In the wake of betrayal, I found that the most radical act was to make a life that pleased me. I kept the office because it anchored me, but I also kept the small pleasures. A garden that taught patience, a neighbor who taught me to bake bread, a pottery class where my clumsy hands shared the kill with Sophia's. I learned to savor meals without calculating how long they bought me and someone else's. Affection. I listened more than I planned. If someone asked whether I regretted the years, I would say no. Choices, even the painful ones, shape us. They form the architecture of who we become. My life after the announcement, the one he thought would be the end, was not an ending at all, but a beginning. The paper that had changed the balance of our lives had also been the key to my own unlocked door dot in the evenings. Sometimes I would stand at the kitchen window and watch the street go by. Lights winked on in houses where strangers lived there. Dramas. A dog barked. A couple laughed. The world was ordinary and forgiving and entirely indifferent to our private catastrophes. I had once believed my value was measured by how well I served someone else's storyline. Now I measured it by how well I tended my own. There were hard moments calls from mutual friends who had taken sides, awkward holiday meals that required choreography, and moments of grief that would arrive like rain when I least expected. But grief, too, is a teacher. It taught me compassion for earlier selves and for people who make choices that hurt themselves, as well as others. Once, several years after the divorce, I ran into Richard at a community lecture about urban gardening. He looked up from the pamphlet in his hand, and for a second we were both the same age we had been in youth. Then the years rolled back and forward in the space between us. He smiled a small, private smile. "You did well," he said. There wasn't apology enough in the world to change us. There wasn't need either. We both were traveling separate routes. I think the hardest lesson was learning to accept that people are not static. Richard had been a man of charm and grand gestures, and he made choices that broke the scaffolding of our life. He would carry that pattern like a scar. I would carry my own scars as well, but I'd learned to frame them as storylines that informed my humility. In the end, what held was the truth that a life can be dismantled and reassembled in new configurations that are not only survivable but also flourishing. I taught women how to rebuild their financial lives. I showed them how to create retirement plans that honored independence and dignity. In doing so, I found my calling. The story that had unfolded at a graduation dinner had yielded an unexpected grace, a pivot from caretaker to architect of change. The envelope was gone filed in some cabinet, eventually burned in a document shredder when legal counsel advised. But the lessons it contained were not ephemeral. They lived in the way I organized my days, in how I set appointments and honored my time, in the way I held Sophia and taught her the sort of math that matters, how to subtract injustice and add resilience at once. When a young woman came into my office shaking and unsure, I sat her down and said simply, "Tell me what you want your life to look like in 5 years." She frowned at the question, as if it were a puzzle she had never considered solving on her own terms. We made a plan. She left with a new account and a sense that the future was a set of choices she could steward. That was the work I wanted, to hand a map to someone else who felt lost. So I rebuilt. Not out of revenge, but out of a pragmatic devotion to the life I wanted to lead. The headlines of our circle faded. The restaurant's memory dimmed. What remained was a house full of books, a business humming with clients, a daughter who had learned to reserve compassion without surrender, and a woman who had remembered how to be herself. Often I think of the moment he chose to declare his leaving. It was theatrical, predictably selfish, and it gave me, paradoxically, the clearest opportunity I'd had in years to choose myself. In the echo of that announcement, I found an uncommon clarity. Endings are not obliterations. They are openings. When one door closes in the theater of someone else's drama, another opens, a plain, serviceable door that leads to a room you furnish for yourself. I teach that now. Keep records. Keep your friends, but keep your own counsel. Save a little, speak a little, and when the time comes, act with the kind of ordered courage that is not showy but enduring. That is the work of a life well tended. And on the night of Sophia's second graduation, a figurative one, the day she celebrated a promotion and a new apartment, we sat together under strain, lights, and toasted the messy brilliance of living. We didn't need music to swell or an audience to applaud. We had learned to applaud ourselves. The years had taught us both how to move with gentleness and how to hold the ledger of our lives without shame. I sometimes wonder how things might have been different if Richard had told the truth sooner. Perhaps he would have kept some things intact. Perhaps his life would have taken a different shape. Regret is a small companion in the long arc of life. It walks beside you but does not determine your path. I made a life after his announcement, one shaped by clarity, by spreadsheets and empathy, by workshops and dinners that were no longer performative. I had not sought vengeance. I had sought a life that I could call my own. In the quiet hours, I would open my ledger and write down small victories. A client who paid off a debt, a woman who opened an IRA for the first time, Sophia's laugh over a burnt cake. These were the numbers that mattered. The rest rumors, dramas, the sound of a champagne glass tipping Fetty, blown into a gutter. What remained was the harder, truer substance, a life rebuilt with deliberate care and soft, persistent courage. If you ask me now whether I would change the way I handled everything, I would say only this: I would not trade my learning for ease. The world taught me a lesson I might not have sought, but one I needed. Keep your accounts in order, keep your heart honest. And when the narrative of your life is interrupted, write the next chapter with hands that know how to count and a spirit that knows how to forgive. The sun sets on that era of my life. Another sun rises. I sit at my desk, the business humming, the teacup at hand, and I'm grateful for the ordinary peace of a woman who has reclaimed her hours. The envelope that started it all was a small, simple thing, but it marked the point when I stopped waiting for someone else to define my worth and began, finally, to count for myself.